So this one, there's a certain slant of light. It's one of my absolute favorite Dickinson poems. It's beautiful. It's very melancholic and kind of sad. It's very spiritual and uplifting. It's one of her more famous ones, so you might have heard of this one before as well. But yeah, it's amazing. So I'm going to read it aloud. I don't normally do this to just kind of keep the video short, but I think this one you want to hear it really. There's a certain slant of light winter afternoons that oppresses like the heft of cathedral tunes. Heavenly hurt it gives us, we can find no scar, but internal difference where the meanings are. None may teach it, any. 'Tis the seal despair, and imperial affliction centres of the air. When it comes, the landscape listens, shadows hold their breath. When it goes, 'tis like the distance on the look of death. So just makes me kind of think about it afterwards, so I go all silent. But yeah, it's beautiful. So it's about basically the speaker. I'll kind of go into sort of what the speaker's doing first before we do an unpicking of the poem. So the speaker is kind of standing there looking out at a winter landscape, and she notices that the light falls at a specific kind of angle in winter in the afternoon. So it's not the type of light that you see all year round. It's just something that happens in winter. And it falls in this really beautiful way across the landscape. And this feels like it's heavenly. So it feels so kind of powerful and beautiful and unusual that it doesn't just seem like normal light. It feels like the light of, the heavens, or the light of God itself, or himself or herself. So it's heavenly and it's spiritual, but it's also oppressive. It's heavy, and it kind of weighs on the soul, a bit like the heavy music that you hear in cathedrals. So if you think about organ music, that kind of sound, that's how the light feels to her. It has a similar effect on her being, and she feels kind of dread or despair. She feels frightened a little bit by by the light. And it creates a silence, and when it leaves an impression of death. So it's a super goth poem. It's very, very dark, very gothic. Sometimes at Dickinson I wear my dark jumper to kind of like evoke the more dark ones, and then you'll notice in some of the videos that I film I wear a light jumper because they're the more fun ones. Sometimes it doesn't match up, but yeah. Right now I'm dressed a lot more goth, and it's suitable for this particular poem. So yeah, it's kind of like a holy light that is capturing the essence of something that we call the sublime. So the sublime is a feeling where you're in shock at how powerful, how beautiful, and how potentially frightening or dangerous something might be. And it's kind of like all of those things entangled together. Something that's beautiful and also terrifying, which I really like. Romantic poetry tends to deal with the idea of the sublime. And it's a spiritual or religious experience to experience the sublime as well. So it gives heavenly hurt. It's painful to even look at. And it doesn't leave an external scar, but it affects your soul. It leaves a scar, an impression on you after you've experienced that kind of winter light. You feel completely different for the rest of your life, and it's left a mark on you. So it's, I think, really beautiful, powerful, quite dark in a way, terrifying, amazing, awesome, all of those things combined at once, this poem. The sense of this light, it leaves a seal of despair upon our soul. And when it goes, it's like the distance created between a living being and the look of death. So it's just, the way that she's kind of drawing connections between natural and spiritual experiences and phenomena in the world is just really powerful, I think, really beautiful in this poem. And it's almost like, with me, I kind of just feel the feeling of that. I don't know if I'm trying to explain it in a way that you could feel that as well. Like you feel that kind of heaviness, or you kind of think back to moments where you've had that like really intense kind of feeling of like dread and awe at something. You don't necessarily have to be spiritual or religious to feel that as well. There's all sorts of situations that we get placed in where you're just kind of, shocked by something. That's kind of what the light makes her do. I think it's amazing that she could have this reaction from looking at, an angle of light in winter. It's really cool. So yeah, symbolism. Light is traditionally used symbolically to refer to a higher power. For example, in this case, a god, probably a Christian god. And yeah, and you'll notice with religions, if you're a religious person or if you study religion, that God is not always depicted as completely kind and generous and helpful. Sometimes God is kind of terrifying because he or she is unknowable. This kind of a non-human element to God that can frighten us and make us feel really humbled and respectful, and also kind of a bit terrified at the same time. So she's kind of drawing on that type of God. Usually we call it more of like an Old Testament God in Christianity, or different more ancient religions have more wrathful or fearsome gods than modern ones tend to. So yeah, it's quite a powerful, terrifying kind of very non-human type of experience, or type of presence that light brings. The fact that there's a temporal reference, winter afternoons, places us into that moment of winter, the season of winter, all of this symbolism that comes along with that. So it's a season of death and decay, and nothing grows in winter. So it's, when she's talking about death, it might be the death of an individual person or even her own death, but probably it's more that kind of cyclical, natural cycle that we see in life, where the seasons rotate, and winter is the season where everything kind of dies back. So a couple of techniques then. There's deliberate pauses in the poem, so I recommend to go and find those. Usually they're indicated by dash, which is typical of Dickinson. And one example that I just analyze here is that shadows hold their breath, and then the pauses there actually emphasize the personification of the shadows, because it's like you have to hold your breath when you're reading the poem. So sometimes Dickinson uses those dashes in a almost like sculptural way in her poetry to emphasize the quality of something that she's describing. And there's a final dash at the end of the poem as well, so you can kind of think about why does it end on a dash? Something unfinished about it there. It's quite a mysterious poem, and the longer you stay with it, the more you think about it. So I've read and analysed this poem like a lot of times, and I still think about it differently each time. It's one of those. Her beliefs or attitudes then. We can observe spirituality all around us. We can see kind of, the workings of nature. Again, you don't necessarily have to be religious to understand this. So you might see nature as an expression of God. You might just be atheistic and see nature as nature and nothing more. But almost everyone in observing nature is kind of impressed and curious about how it functions, and how it seems to operate on these mechanisms, or these kind of these patterns that you find. So the cycles of the seasons is one of those patterns. Dickinson is a very transcendentalist at times in her poetry, and this is a super transcendentalist poem. So if you go to the Scribbly page, I've got loads of context notes on that. But if you just want to quickly look up Transcendentalism and get used to it as well, I recommend doing that, because sometimes she draws on a transcendentalist tradition, and so her poems are not just a random poem, but they're intended to be part of transcendental poetry, or they're kind of influenced by transcendentalism and the kind of philosophical ideas of that poetic movement. So one idea of transcendentalism that is kind of brought to the forefront here is that our inner world mirrors the outer world. So our soul or our psyche or our self and how we are kind of has a parallel with the world at large, like nature and how nature works. So there's, this experience she has externally looking at this light, it kind of filters through to her soul and it affects her soul. You can also think about it symbolically, that maybe we have to experience periods of hardship and difficulty, and those leave scars on us, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. It can be a powerful learning experience, or it can make us kind of spiritually fulfilled and mature in certain ways to go through difficult times. And you'll notice that message comes up time and again in Dickinson's poetry. She's quite big on that as an idea. So there's this idea as well that some aspects of spirituality are frightening, difficult to comprehend. Some aspects of God are difficult. So again, it depends on if you believe in God or if you're religious. But if you are, you can think about your own relationship with God. And if you're not, I recommend to kind of think about your own relationship with kind of nature and the natural world and how you view that, because it's a very similar type thing in some ways. And if you kind of look more into yourself and your own beliefs again, you're going to kind of connect back out to the sentiments in this poem. There's also this sense of oppression. This is more of a political reading or a political interpretation, but she's saying the music in cathedrals weighs heavy on the soul and it feels like it weighs you down. So there's maybe a criticism or a problem that she has with churches there. She maybe thinks that they're oppressive, controlling places. She did react quite negatively to the established religion of her time, and she refused to kind of go to church and ended up just kind of developing her own personal spirituality rather than being part of a church. So the fact that she would find a church frightening, if you are religious, you might see that as confusing, but for Dickinson herself, she kind of rejected or reacted against the churches in her environment. So beautiful poem. Lots of ideas to unpick, very complex and deep and interesting. So I recommend you kind of read it multiple times and stay a bit longer with it. There's a lot more detail on the Scribbly page if you want to download the document on there as well, that kind of goes into some of the deeper context and gives you some tasks to kind of unpick the poem too. Hopefully you love this poem as much as I do. And thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys soon.